Welcome to the NFL slate breakdown for week 11. I'm Jason Gilbo. With me is Russell Clay. You and I, digging through this week, it's kind of more appealing than when I looked at it earlier in the week. I mean, what are your thoughts?
I definitely like this slate more than last week. I think there's pretty clear passing games to attack. I think that I think we have a lot more consistency than heading into last week. Some of the situations we kind of are generally aware now of what Dallas's offense looks like without Zeke and Tyron Smith. We have a general awareness, of a lot of these passing games. I'd say if you had any doubts about the Saints wanting to run the ball, I'd say those are gone. And Tom Brady and the Patriots really shaping into form. So I think, we got a lot of I get a lot of clarification in week 10 personally. I think we're headed in the right direction and things are starting to balance out.
This is a week where, we don't have
The trash.
yeah, there's not a lot of muddled passing games. Like we got the Chiefs, we got New England, we got Oakland. We got some options. So it's kind of like, hey, we've been talking about paying up a running back and just using value. Like there's some decent guys. And the fact that the passing games I feel are kind of underpriced because like Tom Brady may be expensive, but like Cooks isn't that bad, Obviously Gronk's expensive, or you kind of look at like Kelsey and Smith, like they're not killing your lineups. Like they're not overpriced.
Also, Kirk Cousins is very good. What he did against Minnesota and the week before against Seattle. I know he didn't have fantasy domination, but his passing options are something I'm confident in if we're talking about Jamison Crowder and Vernon Davis going forward, pretty much regardless of matchup. So we'll get into that, but I'm not as afraid of the Saints. It's not going to be what happened to the Bills this week. I'll say that.
No, and let's talk quarterbacks. Obviously you mentioned Tom Brady comes in as kind of a pretty healthy number one this week. Obviously that game is in Mexico. Great matchup against Oakland. They're allowing 110 passer rating to opposing QBs. Like, how are we not going to just look at Brady, especially on this week where he really should be over 9K on FanDuel. He really should be closer to 8K on DraftKings, and he's not.
They're giving us a little reprieve on FanDuel for the last 7 weeks. Obviously he had those 2 big games in week 2 and week 3, and then they just priced him up egregiously and even some less than optimal matchups. So we finally get the discount. I think he's the top cash game option. He's the top, I don't want to say the top GPP option, but I mean, if you're looking for someone who's going to score 30, I mean, that's about as close to it as you're going to get.
Yeah, I think there's only really a handful of quarterbacks, and that's probably even being generous, that can, put up basically those type of numbers this week, and Brady's one of them. Obviously, they've kind of gone a little bit more towards the ground. We've seen a couple games where Brady doesn't quite air it out as much, yet, he's still super efficient. So I don't worry about the volume all that much. Really a solid matchup all around. So Brady definitely comes as number one. Would you have Alex Smith as number 2 this week?
I'd certainly say that's viable. Personally, it's between, Alex Smith on FanDuel is pretty money, especially with value considered. In terms of a play, I'd say that. I like Derek Carr a lot. I think that's a game stack game. You can play Carr or Brady, and even if you aren't getting exposure to Carr, you can get exposure to his receiving weapons. So I definitely want exposure to Derek Carr in some way, shape, or form. Carson Wentz, I think he's going to be lower owned with Brady right next to him on FanDuel, so I'm certainly firing away with him still. But yeah, value considered, especially on FanDuel. Alex Smith, vying for that top 2 to 3 play.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned Wentz on FanDuel. Like, he's the most expensive option, probably going to gain a low ownership in this matchup. Sunday night game, going up against Dallas, even though it's on the road, like Dallas's secondary, something I don't mind targeting. Back to Alex Smith, I just think he's kind of the guy that I'm looking at quite a bit, especially on FanDuel, where you mentioned, like, he's, QB 9-10 in terms of pricing. Or obviously on DraftKings, he's the third most expensive, but even 6,700 is not that bad. The Chiefs are an interesting team because I think there's a lot of different ways you can go. Not necessarily like players wise, but it could be a big Kareem Hunt week. Obviously Kelsey's going to be a pretty attractive option to everyone going up against the Giants. So, Smith's a guy I just kind of want to get some exposure to. He's averaging, 0.57 fantasy points per dropback this year. That's third among healthy quarterbacks. When you take Watson out of the mix, huge road favorites. Like we talked about this Giants defense, they've given up. Like they're clearly just, there's no fight in that secondary at all.
Yeah, in terms of punts, I like Flacco and Cutler this week. I really do. They're cheap. Cutler, I'll let you throw out your little stat there, but he's been pretty effective the last few weeks. He's got some nice weapons to exploit that Tampa secondary. Joe Flacco in a great matchup for some of his deeper threats. I think Macklin can get loose if he plays. I think Mike Wallace can get loose. So, I think some of these plays, including Eli Manning, I think this is a week to dive down. I think you're either paying all the way up, Alex Smith, or all the way down.
Flacco's not a guy that I'm on. I can't get behind this guy in this offense really in general. I can see the potential here, but I mean, like looking at last week, I mean, he threw the ball 52 times against Tennessee, still barely scored 17 DK points. I just don't think he has it. Like, I rather go Ryan Fitzpatrick. I rather go Jay Cutler, like you mentioned. I think Cutler's a decent play. It makes me sick saying it, but 2 touchdowns in each of the last 4 games. He had the 3, obviously, against Oakland where he, really went off and got the 300-yard bonus. Like you said, there's a lot of good options. Since the Ajayi trade, I mean, he's thrown the ball 42 and 37 times. They're clearly not running the ball all that much. Bucks defense has allowed the most, 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Like, I like Cutler. I like that range a little bit, but I can't see myself using Flacco.
Fair enough. I'd just say before you totally cancel him out, I'm not saying he's a lock, but when you look at the defenses he's played so far this year, I mean, Minnesota, Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Miami up until last week was relatively strong. Really the only easy matchup he's had is Oakland. Obviously didn't get any passing touchdowns, but they did move the ball. He was 19 to 26 for 200 yards. So Flacco has always been a guy who has those random blow-up games, and I could see 20 points. With that said, Cutler at the same price on FanDuel and Eli pretty much in the same ranges. Makes it easy fade there. Trubisky, pretty much the min there on Yahoo again. I look at Detroit as a team that kind of has been leaking on defense the past 5 or 6 weeks. I think Trubisky can at least imitate what he did last week. He was really a terrible fumble overturn away from having 2 passing touchdowns and over 20, fantasy points. So I think that's real upside you have to start paying attention to, especially with they gave up a lot of rushing yards to Kaiser, and that's something Trubisky can take advantage of as well. So I think you can at least look at it.
Yeah, I think Trubisky's an interesting play this week. I mean, like you say, he's bare min on Yahoo. He's 4,500 on DK. 15 fantasy points last week. He didn't even have a rushing attempt. Like, you can kind of count on some of those games where he can get you 20, 30, 40 rushing yards even, and that's 3 to 4 extra points. So, yeah, I think he's an interesting play this week in GPPs if you kind of just want to stack elsewhere.
Definitely.
Were you looking at this mid-range at all? Like, Matt Stafford on the road against Chicago is not something I'm really interested in. Goff is in a tough spot on the road. I'm still not ruling out Goff in GPPs. I think him and Cousins are actually interesting GPP plays this week.
I'm not playing Goff. And while I complimented Cousins, I'm probably not going to be all that exposed to him or Dak. As I mentioned, I'm kind of going Brady, Wentz, Smith, and then punts, and that's pretty much and Carr, and that's pretty much locked in for me.
Yep. Let's move on to running backs. Obviously no Bell this week. no Zeke for the next, few weeks. This is a kind of an interesting week because some of these guys are guys, they're priced down a little bit. We've seen, the 9K plus backs. We don't really have that this week outside of Fournette on FanDuel. Kareem Hunt coming off a couple of down games. I see this as a bounce back spot for him. Finally kind of getting into the end zone and bringing back that higher ceiling. This is a good spot. Like, I have no problem using Smith and Hunt in the same lineup.
So I guess this is going to be a big week for Hunt because he's had some decent matchups, Houston and Oakland. It's just a matter of how they use him in the red zone because Charkandrick West has kind of just been leeching a lot of the premium touches, which I don't love at all. He should be in for 17 to 20 touches, I believe, at a bare minimum. So I do like the play. It's a great play. I would just use some caution, when evaluating the matchup because he has had a few other good matchups that he hasn't hit in. So something to think about. Obviously, he had those huge runs early in the year. Those have kind of dissipated. I don't know where they've gone. I mean, I know people are still saying his advanced metrics are off the Richter scale or whatever that, whatever people say about shit. But like, he's not gaining yards anymore. You know what I mean? Like, he's sort of been bottled up. I don't know if that's because the game plan changed for opposing defenses, but this isn't a lock like it was after week 4. You know what I mean? Like, it is fadeable. I think he's clearly the number 1 play, but it is fadeable if you want to go passing game heavy.
Yeah, I think so. Like, that's what I mean. Like, there's numerous exposure ways to get to the Chiefs. And when you look at this week, I mean, like Gurley, he's in a tough spot, but I don't mind him here. Like, against Minnesota, especially if he can get used like he's been getting used in the passing game. I mean, he's seen 18 targets over the past 3 weeks. He's caught 12 of them. Like, he's getting that extra PPR bonus. We saw it last week. Like, he still had 19 DK points without finding the end zone. FanDuel, obviously, it's a little bit different story. I'm not as in love with basically this top tier running backs as I have been in prior weeks.
I just look at the Seattle and Jacksonville games as what we're kind of looking at this week for Gurley. I still like Minnesota's D. Maybe he gets a chunk play, but it's really going to be about if Minnesota's passing game what they can do against the Rams secondary and whether they can hold off Aaron Donald. If they can, then I think we're looking at a really ugly game for Gurley. So that downside's there. So I want to talk about Melvin Gordon because people are jumping ship like it's the Titanic. And I don't understand it. He has the same yards per carry as Le'Veon Bell this year. And it's like no one's batting an eye that Le'Veon Bell is, sort of not breaking those big runs. But Melvin Gordon had a ton of touches last week. You know what I mean? It wasn't like he got pushed to the side. He got 20 touches. So I don't know. I don't know. I think he's a great play against this Buffalo team. 7,800 on FanDuel and pretty reasonable across all the slates. I think he's going to be low owned based on, what people are talking about, mainstream wise. I think he's a great play.
I see his ownership kind of going 2 ways. It's for the people that kind of believe that he is pushed to the side, he's not playing well, all that. And then there's the people that look and go, oh my God, he's getting this Bills team that's given up 5,000 yards on the ground over the last 2 weeks, and they're going to plug him in. I love him this week. Like you said, I mean, the touches were there. He still saw 8 targets in the passing game. Obviously it was kind of a fluky thing with Eckler, getting some touches in there and getting those fancy production. Like, I'm on board here. I like the matchup, against Buffalo. Obviously, their stats are super inflated over the last 2 weeks in terms of what they've allowed fantasy-wise. But I think that's a trend. I think that's going to be something that continues the rest of the year. I don't think that's anything that's fluky. I like Gordon. Like you said, I think he's a good chance of scoring 20-plus fantasy points this week. Him and basically Mark Ingram and Kamara are kind of the 3 guys that I'm really encouraged with this week, and I'll have a lot of exposure.
Certainly. What are you doing with McCoy with no Tyrod?
I'm off the Bills. Like
Mm.
I won't be using the Bills this week at all or any fashion. Obviously good corners out there in Los Angeles. The rush defense has been okay. Um, I'm I'm not doing it. I think this is a train wreck the rest of the way.
Right. Jerick McKinnon, relatively cheap on DraftKings. And if you remember back to that Rams Redskins game, Chris Thompson absolutely annihilated that Rams team. Just destroyed them in every sense of the word. I kind of see McKinnon in that same ilk. Are you on McKinnon this week?
I think he's a good GPP play.
Yeah.
You mentioned Thompson. I rather take Thompson, for 300 less on DK.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't mind McKinnon. I think that's an interesting tier there, especially on like DraftKings in terms of PPR.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, really, Thompson is even a guy I'm interested on FanDuel at 6,800. New Orleans 25th in DVOA against the run. 8.6 targets per game are going to backs this season. That's more than any other wide receiver against the Saints.
Could so we there's been a lot of cautious hope for Doug Martin for me the last 3 or 4 weeks. I haven't really been getting much exposure, but you kind of keeping an eye on it. He's always been a guy who breaks those huge runs and has those big games. Are you on him at all this week? I might be taking some shots.
Um, it's hard for me to.
Yeah.
I just have a hard time going that route. I mean, I kind of like the Thompson McKinnon train that you just mentioned. Given the fact that he has dropped down quite a bit, I do like him as a cheap guy. I don't think it's the worst option in the world. Like you can go that route as like a flex or something like that, I guess. But I don't know. I'm not in love with it.
Rex Burke had 3,600 on DK, 5,400 or 5,700 on FanDuel. I'm trying it in a Brady lineup. I think you can definitely throw that in there.
Yeah, he's getting these usage in high efficiency, high fantasy production type roles. Like I'm cool with him. I think another guy that's pretty interesting is Kenyon Drake. Obviously back to back weeks was 17, DK points. He's only 4,800. This Miami defense has obviously clearly slipped. They looked decent against the run earlier this year, but not so much of late. Or sorry, Tampa. He's been the more productive guy. Obviously, he relies on the big chunk yardage plays, but I'm willing to take a shot on him.
Yeah, again, I like this Dolphins defense or offense this week.
So, how do you feel about Jamal Williams?
No, stop it.
Yeah, I'm not.
We're gonna stop that right now. I saw people touting him after his immaculate 20 carry 67-yard performance. Get the hell out of here.
I just wanted to bring it up as a talking point because, like you said, I don't think there's any real upside here.
I don't understand why people take these stands on these random unathletic, like unproductive running backs. I mean, Jamal Williams was a jag in college and people fell in love with his tape, but I mean, he's a whatever, man.
Yeah.
If he gets 20 carries, maybe he gets 60 yards and a touchdown. That's cool. But he's not like
take your 12 points.
Yeah, like he's fine, but he's not like special. So that's the end of that.
I just don't. 4,900 on DK. I'll spend the extra couple hundred to get Thompson. He doesn't really have any appeal for me on FanDuel either. Like he's cheap, but I don't need a $5,600 running back this week.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see it. If you were making a core of 4 running backs, who would you put in this week?
A core, definitely Kareem Hunt, Melvin Gordon for sure for me. I think Burkhead isn't a lock, but he's a really special play on DK with the way they're using him. I wouldn't say anyone else is really a lock for me. I'm not going to tell anyone not to play Mark Ingram at this point, though. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I think, if I'm choosing 4, it's Melvin Gordon, Ingram, Kareem Hunt, and Chris Thompson. I'm actually just infatuated with Thompson in this matchup against the Saints. Once again, they're just his use in terms of a wide receiver is what I'm after against this matchup.
Fair enough.
So let's move on to wide receiver and kind of I guess, bland wide receiver week. There's some guys that are options, but, we don't have, Antonio Brown, no Julio Jones. We kind of get some guys that are struggling right now or in bad matchups. Like Hopkins is going to see Patrick Peterson, AJ Green against Denver. It's kind of iffy this week.
Yeah, and the price tags of some of these guys on DK kind of tell that story. AJ Green 7,000. I don't remember the last time he was that cheap, but I'm certainly not playing him against Denver with Andy Dalton at the helm. I think, I'll let you talk about Mike Evans, but that was a play you kind of instantly clicked on. And, after watching Devin Funchess on Monday night, I mean, Mike Evans is a much better version of Devin Funchess, and Devin Funchess just ate them alive. So I think that's certainly something to look at, even with Fitzpatrick. He's not afraid to throw it in there in tight coverage.
No, he's not. And, he's 7,900 on DK. He's 78 on FanDuel, which is just kind of a tremendous steal. It's really all that tier is fairly cheap for where we're used to seeing them. You mentioned Fitzpatrick. Like I think that's a viable stack this week. We haven't seen Evans clip 100-yard mark at all this year. Like he's been pretty quiet. But the targets are going to be there. He should see 8+ targets this week. Miami, 31st in DVOA against wide receiver ones. I just think this is a spot where you can really use him because, as you mentioned, Green against Denver, Hopkins against Peterson, Thomas is 8,600. I get, obviously he's coming off of a decent game, but the guy hasn't scored since October 1st. Like a guy who's 8,600 on FanDuel, I don't want 16 FanDuel points. I can get something else. And Thomas, once again, I don't get the appeal.
No, that's certainly fair. For this season, it's 16 FanDuel points is like, oh my God, what just happened? You're amazing if you get 16 points, but for that value, that's horrible. So, Hopkins, I'm not playing. I'm not a big Thielen guy, even though he's been fantastic this year. So I'm not really on the Minnesota passing game. Tate doesn't really appeal to me. I really go right to Tyreek Hill, and I look at, we talked about it on salary exploitation, but I see a guy like Robert Woods running for 50 yards, breaking tackles. I don't even want to know what Tyreek Hill is going to do to this defense. So that's the direction I'm headed. Crabtree, Amari Cooper. Those are really my three guys in the mid-range I'm targeting.
Yeah, I'm with you. The Tyreek Hill GPP play, I won't trust him in cash games or anything by that means. I think you're probably in the same boat because he really is. He's a single-digit guy or he's getting 20+. There's hardly an in-between.
Oh, there's no in-between. There's literally he's either on the season, he's either below 6 or below or 7 or below or 14 or above every single game. Like there's no mid-range. There's no
and that 14 was just last week. Like that was it.
There's no 11-point Tyreek Hill games, literally. Yeah. So
yeah, I don't mind him. I think he's a good stacking option. If you're going that way and just going full on Chief stack, I think he's also a good pivot off of Kelsey if you want to go in a different direction because Kelsey's obviously going to be a chalk option and probably a good chalk option. Fitzgerald's interesting to me this week. Runs obviously his majority of routes out of the slot. Going to see Kareem Jackson, who's just been absolutely torched this season. And, obviously I think whoever's under center is going to be looking Fitz's way. He's a staple. Like he saw 14 targets last week. I know Gabbert's going to start this week. The price came up, which is a little disappointing. On draft or on FanDuel, he's 6,900. I think that's a nice bargain. Obviously, DK is a little bit more. He's the same price. I'm still enamored with Fitz. Like,
I get it. I'm not going to be doing it. I don't love that tier. Something I'll note on Marvin Jones when Kenny Golladay plays, not much he kind of limits those big plays for Jones and some of those targets. In those first 2 games of the season when Golladay played, he only had 3 catches and 7 targets. And then last week, he only had 2 targets after getting, 36 in the previous 3 games. So when Galladay's in, I certainly think you should, be aware with Marvin Jones. I know he was 33% last week, which was pretty blasphemous for that matchup. But especially with Golladay back, I'd be aware of that.
So you mentioned the basically the New England, the Oakland passing games of like Brandon Cooks, Amari Cooper, Michael Crabtree. Cooks I like this week quite a bit. The price is down. He's only 6,600 on DK. He's 77 on FanDuel, but I'm still okay with that because he's kind of in the best spot of those ranges. Oakland, 31st in DVOA against wide receiver ones. They're 32nd against deep passes. That's kind of basically where we're looking at Cooks. Like, he's had the one big game, and I think this is the next spot. Like, this is 100+ yards and 2 touchdown week. I'm saying that for Cooks here.
Man, I hope so. I've kind of been holding out hope. You never really get that ownership you want for how he's played this year. He hasn't really been a high upside guy other than that one game. So I like him as a play. I love him as a play. I'm going to be locking him in. But, there is downside. There's a lot of weapons in that offense. And if they get on teams quickly, what was interesting, if you watch the end of that Patriots game, they were force-feeding him the ball at the end of the game when it was in hand and trying to get him his numbers, including on screen passes on the last drive of the game. I thought that was really interesting, and it might be something we see going forward where they try to force-feed him targets to get him his numbers because, he got frustrated in New Orleans, and I wonder if, they're generally aware that they want to get him his numbers,
Yeah, 11 targets last week. He saw 8 the week before in pretty tough matchups. Like, he really hasn't had a great matchup outside the Chiefs at the beginning of the year in Houston. Outside that's been pretty kind of casual. So I think this is a spot where he does break out. And even on the other side of that, like Crabtree and Cooper are both in play for me. I like their prices a lot more on DK than I do over on FanDuel, but that's not to say that they're not usable there either.
Definitely. Alshon in play, don't love it. Landry and Parker are going to be guys I'm getting a lot of exposure to this week. I just think Tampa, they haven't given up a ton of huge games, but they give up a lot of good games. And that's what I'm looking for from Parker and Landry. So I think they're pretty reasonably priced. I'm off the Detroit bandwagon this week. I'm off Devontae Adams. I'm not doing Deshaun Jordy. So really I'm looking at Miami receivers and Sterling Shepard in that range.
Yeah, Sterling's the guy that I'm looking at this week. Obviously 22 targets over the last 2 weeks. He's caught 16 of them for over 200 yards. Priced up a little bit on DK. I still think he's one of the better plays over on FanDuel where he's still 6,500. And not to, 63 on DK I think is still certainly reasonable with the PPR because he's going to get a ton of receptions. Robert Woods obviously coming off just monster games over the last 2 weeks. He's priced up. But from what I've seen so far here, like it doesn't look like Xavier Rhodes is going to shadow him. And if that's the case, like I think he can put up another good week. He's going to see Trey Waynes, who's been a guy I just target all year long.
That's fair. I'm not diving into the Rams offense as much this week in general, so that's going to lead me off of Woods. But, if you want to – I wouldn't even consider it chasing points because the Rams are literally the top offense in the league. And, I don't see why that wouldn't at least continue in some sense. Tougher matchup, though, so –
when you look cheap, there was kind of 2 guys that stood out to me this week. Jamison Crowder was one of them. Mm-hmm. Seen 24 targets over the past 2 weeks. Like this was supposed to be Crowder's year to kind of be a high target guy, high PPR guy, and it hasn't happened up until really the last 2 weeks. So he's still 4,300 on DK. That's probably where I'd use him the most. He's going to dodge the two main corners. He's not going to see Ken Crawley's not going to see Lattimore because he runs out of the slot. So like he's in a pretty good spot. Should be checked down to quite a bit. Yeah, I think he's the other one. And Keelan Cole was the other guy that I'm looking at for Jacksonville. Alan Hearn's doubtful this week. Marquise Lee iffy. Keelan only 3,800 on DK. Saw 8 targets last week. He's seen 16 over the last 3 weeks. Been kind of hovering around 8-9 DK points per game. And you won't see Jason McCourty, who's been excellent. So if you need a guy, I mean, Jacksonville obviously banged up at the wide receiver spot. He's something to keep an eye on.
Well, we'll see with D.D. Westbrook as well, because that could be the backdoor cover that is kind of ugly. That's going to, if D.D. is somehow out again, I like that play a lot. But, yeah, I just be aware of that news. Beyond that, I mean, Dontrell Inman kind of pops up in the cafe value. If you play a Trubisky lineup, maybe you can throw that in there, as he's a guy that's kind of, got 8 targets last week. But that's not a fun play. Like, that's not fun at all.
I mean, you can take a GPP shot on Kenny Stills. He's 8-4, 10, 9 targets. Obviously, some of those with Parker out, but with Color, winging those, those balls down the field. Like I'm okay with him in GPPs at a cheap guy, because really there's not a ton that I'm in love with this week at the cheaper side. Like we had a lot over the last few weeks. We had Shepard cheap, we had Goodwin, we had Woods cheap. Like now it's starting to dry up. So is that it for you at wide receiver?
Yeah, I kind of like it as a pay up week. How about that?
Yeah, for once. Let's move to tight end, where it's basically Travis Kelce's area this week, going up against a Giants team that's allowed 10 touchdowns to tight ends this year. Obviously, the most fantasy points. This is not a shocker to anyone. We don't need to say play Travis Kelce against the Giants.
No, we don't. No. And on DK, I think you can go Kelce Gronk and feel pretty good about it with that, combo. It's a great week at tight end. You got Evan Ingram, who I think is pretty much an every week play, even if he doesn't get that touchdown. You mentioned dump offs. I think Vernon Davis is another guy again, where if Jordan Reed doesn't play, he's a good play. He really is. He's a spry old man. I think I'm off Cameron Brate until further notice with Ryan Fitzpatrick in there. CJ Fedorowicz, tough matchup last week. He's seeing the targets. He saw 6 targets, so that was there. Might want to wait this one out, though. I tried to get cute last week, and it did not pay off. I think you kind of wait that one out, yeah?
Yeah, I think so. Like you mentioned, Vernon Davis, his price actually went down on FanDuel to 5,200. If Reed sits, he's the best cheaper guy. You mentioned Bray, not really looking at him this week. That was something that was just completely off. I mean, I don't understand the game plan from Tampa last week at all. Jared Cook's the guy that I'm taking a look at, more so in tournaments. He's been a guy over the last few weeks, 7, 5, 9 targets. He's caught all but 3 of them. He's averaged over 14 yards per reception in those spans. Like, this is a good spot for him. I think if you're not really looking at Crabtree or Cooper and you still want some exposure, I think Jared Cook's a really good contrarian piece to that game stack, and at a cheaper price. And you mentioned the Gronk-Kelce lineup. One, I think Gronk's an excellent pivot away from Kelce if you're trying to make just a one decision and get a leverage. But you mentioned both of them, because there's not really a lot of wide receivers up top, like in that price range. You can easily go a Gronk-Kelce lineup and be contrarian in GPPs. I don't think it's going to be all that popular.
I like Gronk more than, most all the 7K guys at wide receiver. So I think that's a very good play. I don't know, man. Tyler Kroft, I think he's got that Denver matchup. They totally shut down receivers. I think it's in play. He's 2,900 on DK. I definitely think he's in play, especially if you're trying to save.
That's a good call, because, I mean, really the only team that's worse than the Giants so far this year that we've really been picking on is Denver, allowing the second most fantasy points. We saw Dwayne Allen get in and get that touchdown, but you look, it was Gronk, 74 yards, Allen, 11, Bennett 38. Like they racked up over 100 yards between those guys.
Yeah.
We saw Kelsey light them on fire. We saw Ingram light them on fire. Witten, Charles Clay got touchdowns earlier in the year. Yeah, this is definitely a spot where I actually don't mind that.
Right.
So I'm kind of looking more and more at that. Croft might be the value steal of that option that kind of rules out some of those other guys.
Definitely.
So let's move on to defense this week. Jacksonville is priced up quite a bit. They're 5,600 on FanDuel, 4K on DraftKings. Are they kind of just that team that you're trying to plug in as much as possible?
So I think you look at it this way. What was the Chargers' success? How did they score? It was these dink and dunk dump offs, which Duke Johnson can do. Duke Johnson can break some big runs. Isaiah Crowell can sort of break some big runs if he gets open. But we know the interceptions are coming. We know the sacks are coming. It's just if the wave hits early, it's going to be 30 fantasy points. And I mean, that's what we've seen from Jacksonville all year. This might be their best matchup of the year with DeShone Kizer. So I don't care about price. If they were 5K on DK, I'd still think about playing them. They're like a wide receiver 1 this week, honestly. But, you look at what the Chargers did last week. They kind of played keep away. That's Phillip Rivers, though. Again, we mentioned that last week. That's Phillip Rivers to a T. He just kind of dink and dunks. I don't know that DeShone Kizer can do that. So the sacks are going to be there. It's going to get ugly. It's just if the Browns can get those 14 real points and sort of limit that upside and maybe keep them to 12 instead of 30. That's going to be the question,
Yeah, and we kind of saw that last week when they played the Lions. Like, the Lions got that defensive touchdown. They got 4 sacks, and they scored 14 points. They gave up over 400 yards and 24, points.
Right.
So it's kind of like, do they still bring that floor to the table? I think they do. Like, I think Jacksonville's kind of a clear-cut option. Like, I like them over Denver. I like them over New Orleans. I like them over Detroit when looking at some of those top tiers. And then I kind of take a big jump down after that.
Mm-hmm. I think we're all going to be having our eyes on the Chargers D this week, especially against no Tyrod, Nathan Peterman making his first start. I think we all have visions of Joey Bosa with strip sack touchdowns. That certainly could be a reality,
They're generating a ton of pressure. 11 sacks over the past 3 weeks. They've had 3 games with 5 sacks already this year. Tyrod, obviously mobile, can escape the pockets. He didn't turn the ball over a ton. Now we get a rookie quarterback on the road. It's not a hostile environment because only 50 people show up to the Chargers games, but
half of them are the opposing team's fans.
Bills Mafia they get the wagon across the country like freaking Oregon Trail.
Yeah.
I think they're the cheap option that you can look at this week. They'll probably be pretty chalky, and that's fine. You only need about 7 or 8 fantasy points out of them anyway. So I'm looking at that way. I think you can look at like Green Bay, Baltimore, Arizona is kind of the GPP pivots. Even Cincinnati, I don't mind.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. Those are really, I'm locking in Chargers. I'm locking in Jags, depending on how salary fits, and that's how I'm going this week. I've cut it down for defenses this year. I just think you can hedge if you want, but I've just found it much easier to go one way. Obviously, you're going to have weeks like Broncos week 7 or whatever that was, but you're also going to have pretty high floors most weeks with some of those pay up options. So Jags for me.
Yep, I'm with you. That's it for week 11. A pretty good week. I don't think there's going to be much that changes moving forward in terms of news. You obviously mentioned D.D. Westbrook as a guy to possibly pay attention to with Keelan Cole. That's kind of the only situation I'm really monitoring. I think everything else is pretty much straightforward.
Definitely.
I guess maybe Phillip Rivers, right? Concussion protocol. He was limited at practice today. I think he's in.
If he doesn't play, I'll be less excited about Melvin Gordon, but I wasn't playing anyone on the Chargers passing game anyway.
No. So those are really the situations to keep an eye on. You can head to NordTodayFantasyCafe.com, check out our great tools and content. Cheat sheets will be up. We'll have a few more videos coming up later in the week. If you like what we're doing, give us a thumbs up and subscribe. And good luck in week 11.